Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the NASBE webinar, working with institutes of higher education to advance the ECE workforce. Next slide, please. My name is Winona Howe, and I am the Director of Early Learning at NASBE. I'm so excited to host you today to hear about this great program that supports ECE educators in their career pathways and credentials in Illinois. Next slide, please. Before we get started, I would love to quickly go through some logistics. So all participants are muted. We will record this webinar and we will share the recording and slides with you after the webinar through an email. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat box. We will have some time towards the end to have our speakers address them. Please also keep an eye in the chat since we will put some links there. Those are for the resources. The closed captioning is enabled for this webinar. And if you don't mind, please use the chat to introduce yourself to the group. Include your name, where you're from, and the role you play in the ECE space. Next slide, please. I would love to quickly talk about NASBE's signature ECE activity, which is the NASBE ECE State Network. It was established in 2016 with the purpose of supporting the ECE workforce through effective state policies. And in the past 6 years, we built state boards' capacity in the ECE space, informed policy by bridging research and policy making at the state level, and shared best practices with each other. To date, we work with 10 states plus DC and Guam in the network. As you can see, Illinois joined the network in 2020. The issue they tackled was around ECE educator shortages. We're just so excited to use this platform to highlight some of the great work they're doing today. Next slide, please. I would also encourage you to go to our website for more information about our ECE program. We just published a policy update around how to support educators in the early literacy space. So please check that out on our website. Next slide, please. So now I would love to introduce Illinois State Board member, also the chair of the NASBE Board of Directors, Dr. Christine Benson, to kick off the webinar. Dr. Benson.
Welcome to all. And we're just having a wonderful day here in Central Illinois, so I hope many of you can say the same. Good afternoon, and I am Dr. Chris Benson, a board member at the Illinois State Board of Education, and also have the pleasure to currently serve as chair of NASBE. I'd like to welcome you to the National Association of State Boards of Education's webinar today, entitled Working with Institutes of Higher Education to Advance the ECE Workforce webinar. Early childhood education is dear to my heart. I'm a former educator of 35 years, 17 years as a teacher, 18 years as a superintendent of schools. And as a superintendent, I did walkabouts, visiting classrooms at the different schools in our district. And one of my favorite stops was always walking into an ECE, or we call them the Rugrats classroom. With its high energy level and the immense amount of education from all modality of learning styles, it rejuvenated and inspired me for the rest of the day. And as current brain research clearly demonstrates, why learning in the earliest years is so important, including breaking the cycle of poverty. We know that a highly trained workforce is the main pillar of high quality early childhood programs. It's imperative that we support early childhood educators by eliminating the barriers that would prevent them from obtaining the credentials they need to teach in an early childhood classroom. The Illinois State Board of Education understands this too. That's why we've made it a high priority to collaborate to better understand and support ECE education. Throughout my tenure on the board, it is entrenched in our strategic plan to reach out in partnerships to work together rather than as silos. So the ECACE, the Early Childhood Access Consortium for Equity organization, was developed. In Illinois, we have a mixed delivery system with both preschool and early learning services provided by school districts and community-based organizations. We recognize that stakeholders all need to work together to support the early childhood workforce. As a result, collaborative efforts are underway among the Illinois Board of Higher Ed, the Illinois Community College Board, the Illinois Student Assistance Commission, the Illinois State Board of Education, the Governor's Office of Early Childhood Development, and the Illinois Department of Human Services. And it is exciting to see everyone working together in support of our early childhood workforce in Illinois. And the context for this works for also the nationwide teacher shortage that affects certain districts, subjects, and regions do it disproportionately. So our collective goal is to build systems and solutions for a strong ECE workforce that are meaningful, sustainable, and equitable. Today, you will hear from some of the key stakeholders in this work, who will each share what their role is in this wonderful partnership to support our early childhood workforce. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you find the webinar enlightening. It is a pleasure to introduce our first presenter, Dr. Marcus Brown, Deputy Director for Academic Affairs and Student Success of the Illinois Community College Board. Marcus?
Thank you, Dr. Benson, and it's a pleasure to be here. We are certainly excited to talk about the work of the Early Childhood Access Consortium for Equity. That's not a tongue twister at all, but for ease, we say ECACE. And so that's sort of the acronym we've taken on. I assure you that sometimes seeing those 6 agencies up there and trying to understand the trial of getting us all to work together and be on one page is sometimes as clunky as it seems. But the reality is, I think we all know that we're working together toward the same goal. And in that end, the results have been remarkably easy to get to. So we understand that we're oriented in the same way and that we can get there together. I think our goal is together we can achieve more. So with that, I'm going to go to the next slide and talk a little bit about what we're all going to talk about today. So you're going to hear from a couple of our other presenters as well here in just a second too. But just so you have some framing about the presentation itself, we're going to talk a little bit about who the workforce is, who we are trying to assist, and what that means in the work. We're going to talk about the establishment of the ECACE, the consortium, if you sometimes hear me say that. And then we're going to talk about how that looked across other agencies, but particularly we're going to take a deep dive into the work that ESBE did, the State Board of Education, around helping to sort of think through and support the work and clarify administrative rule in that regard. And then we'll talk a little bit about the future of funding and what the work looks like in Illinois from there. And finally, tell you a little bit about what that success has looked like in the state itself. So with that, I'm going to hop right in and I'll introduce to you one of my co-presenters here, Michelle Wood from Department of Human Services.
Good afternoon, everyone. Now we're going to talk a little bit about who the workforce is assisting. Next slide, please. So what we know is overall, the childcare workforce, it's quite diverse, right? We know more so that the public schools, more so than the public school teaching workforce, right? This means that many community childcare workers reflect the communities they serve, right? However, similar to the public school workforce, the majority of the staff in supervisory positions, which earn more money, there are white. In addition to racially diverse, there are also growing language diversity, especially among younger staff. So what does this mean? There's still inequities in teaching. So how are we going to offset those inequities? Next slide, please. Nationally, as well as in Illinois, supporting the development of the youngest children as childcare workers paid less than 98% of all other jobs. Of the childcare workers with bachelor's degrees, they earn 30% less on average than their colleagues in K-8 school systems. The poverty rate for childcare workers is twice as high as other workers in Illinois and 8.5 times higher than other educators in Illinois. Teachers work with infants and toddlers tend to earn around $8,000 less than preschool teachers. Black early educators earn on average 78 cents per hour less than their white counterparts. And all of this data is put out by UC Berkeley. So although this data seems very stark in comparison, I think it's very telling about the work that needs to go on in the state. All these initiatives that are being put out are being put out for a reason, right? We know that this work is building the childcare workforce. It's needing to happen. For that reason, all these initiatives are to build out and help us with our workforce crisis. Next slide, please. Because the low wages that providers can afford to pay in this broken market, it's not surprising that the turnover is especially high in the field. College students are not counseled into the childcare field because it's just not lucrative. The workforce crisis makes it extremely difficult for childcare providers to keep classrooms open and staffed, which keeps the overall childcare market smaller. And it needs to, in order to meet the needs of the families that they care for. And all of this turnover detracts from the benefits of the children experiencing high quality early childhood environments where stable structure and consistency of support in order to build those relationships between the adults and the children, which is the core driver of a positive child development experience. And they're just not getting that. So that is the need, why we need all of these initiatives. What's needed now is a sustainable funding at a scale that can be used to pay better wages to staff and fix this broken market. Next slide, please.
Thank you.
And now Marcus is going to talk about the consortium.
Shifts back to me. So, I think hearing that context about what's in the workforce and who we're trying to serve gives you some idea about how we got to the Early Childhood Access Consortium for Equity, or the consortium as you'll often hear me refer to. So if you go to the next slide, one of the reasons that this work becomes important is that we want to sort of personalize what that looks like. So on the next slide there, you'll see that this is Cindy Jones. She's a mother of 8, a grandmother of 27, and a great-grandmother of 3. She's been a member of the early childhood workforce for some time. In June, she's graduating with her bachelor's degree, and her goal is to open a child care center. Though she started college right out of high school, she had to drop out to take care of her family. But she had a passion for working for children, and that's what brought her back to school. With the support of the University of Illinois Chicago, she has been successful, and she considers herself a lifelong learner. But because of the work I'm going to talk about with the Early Childhood Consortium, she's going to also continue her pursuit of education and be able to earn a master's degree here. What we know, though, about the early childhood workforce is that they tend to be women. Many are women of color, and they have family responsibilities, but a passion for working for young children. I shouldn't say but, and a passion for working for young children. So what does that mean? That means that this is a workforce that we continue to need to support and fully wrap our arms around in order to make sure that this workforce is sustainable. So on the next slide, we get to the Early Childhood Access Consortium for Equity Act. So this was a law that was put into place now about I guess 2 years ago now. It seems so short now when I talk about that. But the idea of the consortium was to support students to enroll, persist, and to complete, to make sure that we were advancing equity in the workforce itself, and to provide programs when, where, and how students needed to use them. So traditionally in higher ed programs, we deliver what we call a traditional model. It's for folks who are, young enough to be able to not have to work. They go to school from, 9 to 2 during the day, but that's frankly when this particular population needs to be working. They have families that they're trying to support. And so understanding that model won't work for them. We also wanted to make sure that this bill also ensures that we have a seamless transfer from 2 years to 4-year institutions and I'll talk a little bit about that with the AAS degree, which is a new sort of twist on transfer, and then to help make sure that we determine the needs of employers. So it calls for all the state agencies that you saw before to work together, both in the consortium and in the advisory committee as well. So if you go to the next slide, I just want to talk a little bit about what that looks like. So for example, on that first column there, you see all of the state agencies working together to ensure that we are providing this work. So everyone from the Board of Higher Education, the Community College Board, the State Board of Education, Department of Human Services, the Governor's Office of Early Childhood Development, and the State Assistance Commission all have to work together to make sure that this project works. So for example, as we think about what that looks like, we can have this great idea, but there's a scholarship attached to this particular project. And so our State Assistance Commission needs to be able to manage and oversee the implementation of that scholarship. We worked very closely with DHS and the Governor's Office in terms of identifying the funding and the output necessary. What are the outcomes that we would expect over the time that this funding is available? So we had to work very closely with them. And obviously, as the boards that oversee both in teacher preparation and the education thereof, it's critical that we work together. So when we talk about the advisory, those state agencies all have a lead role in helping to understand and to move the advisory forward. But this advisory committee is one of the mechanisms in which we can support the work. So it's made up of, this advisory is led by the state agencies, but includes the workforce, includes legislators, includes higher education institutions, includes advocates, and includes parents, all of the folks who are critical in making sure that we understand the necessary issues in the workforce in order to get this work done. That also pairs with the consortium itself, which is made up of 61 higher education institutions. It's all the public institutions, community colleges, and state universities. In addition, it also includes about 13 private institutions in the state, all of who are instrumental in moving the education of early childhood forward. So coming together and understanding what the educational needs are in terms of the higher ed space, and how do we make sure that we're addressing those in ways that make sense. And then finally, thinking through that, the work from the advisory through the consortium leads us to making sure that we're focused on the workforce, that we think about employers and children and families and how this work impacts them and supports them, that we think about the higher ed structure and what kinds of changes that we can support, what kinds of changes are needed, but also broader to the workforce. And you'll hear a bit more about this a little bit later, making sure that we're not only supporting the workforce that we have, but we're doing the work that we need to do to make sure that we can expand that workforce to address the needs in our state. And certainly the governor has outlined an ambitious mission to make Illinois the #1 state to raise a family, but in addition to have the #1 state centered on early childhood learning. So we have a lofty mission from our governor, but it takes a lot of work to do that. And I'm going to dig in here in just a moment to talk a little bit about some of those workforce supports. So the scholarship itself, the navigators and mentors, and then relief for financial holds, all of which we think are levers that help move students forward. So on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about the Early Childhood Scholarship. This scholarship, funded by DHS, allows us to fund tuition and fees plus funding up to the total cost of attendance at a consortium institution. So that can include things like room and board, or can include things like sometimes the technical support that students need. They may need some equipment or books, those kinds of things. They may need some support for transportation back and forth to the campus. But any of those things that can be covered under the total cost of attendance are eligible under the scholarship. That scholarship we launched about a year ago, and we continue, and it's focused on, because of the work that we're doing, it's focused on the incumbent workforce member who is seeking an undergraduate degree, who has worked in an early childhood setting, in childcare and preschool, in those settings. This coming fall, we're fortunate that we're able to expand that scholarship to those students, to all students who are in undergraduate, who are incumbent workers seeking an early childhood degree, those who are post-baccalaureate seekers, those who are master's degree and other associate's degrees, and all freshman and sophomore four-year institutions. So we hope that we can really move the needle on addressing the part of the shortage in the workforce by making sure that we have enough folks coming into that. So we know that so far in this current year, we've had about 3,200 applications submitted for those particular scholarships and have been able to fund nearly 1,700 students at about $20 million in scholarship assistance. We'll continue to move through that for the rest of this term and into the summer, and then launch up to this fall enrollment coming soon. If you go to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about the scholarship, because one of the things we continue to be centered on is what impact we're having when we do that. So I think one of the first call outs I want to talk about is around income. So when we talk about who's getting the scholarship, what we know is that 76% of the recipients had an expected family contribution, that's a financial aid term, of less than $10,000. Which means that we're still servicing the most needy students as part of this particular scholarship. But this allows them to be able to fully fund their education without the concern about student loans, without the concern about other levers. This allows us to support them through their enrollment and to persist through. In addition to that, what we do know is that we continue to serve those working populations. So while we are servicing some of the younger employees, potential employees and students, we know that we're serving about 60% of those students who are 25 or older in this population through this scholarship. You see a bit of the demographic there about race and ethnicity. And so that continues to be one of the levers that we continue to check back on. Are we continuing to make sure that we are supporting the populations that we intend to, that we have endeavored to support? So we continue to do these checks. One of the other things, and I'll just talk really quickly about this, is that we also do a regionality check. And so we have some data that talks about where the workers are and how we can support those. So we know that about 51% of the students who are accessing the scholarship live in downstate Illinois. That probably doesn't mean anything for anybody not in Illinois, but what it does mean is that it's outside the city of Chicago and really outside the what we call collar counties of Chicago as well. So when we talk about downstate, about half of the recipients are downstate, and then we have another third in the collar counties and northern region of Illinois, and then about 16% in Chicago. Now you might look at that Chicago number and say, well, that's really curious, how only 16% are in Chicago? But what we do know is that we have a couple of other scholarship levers that really help support that, because Chicago itself has been a leader in making sure that we address the pipeline for early childhood. So there are two other significant scholarships in the Chicago region that also help support this population as well. Next slide. And so one of the other sort of critical things that we talk about with the consortium is this full transfer of the Associate of Applied Science degree. This is historically a degree that is what we call a terminal degree. So many folks would come and get this particular degree, and then they would go directly into the workforce. And this allows them to take that degree and come into the university, if you will, to continue their baccalaureate degree, being able to transfer the full degree itself into the university for credit, and then to be able to progress at that same proportion of credit that's left in the baccalaureate degree. So they're not losing any credits by having the AAS degree, and they're still staying on that same timeline in which we traditionally think about a junior coming in and having 2 years left. So they continue to do that. The other thing is that we introduced a credit for the CDA, or the Child Development Associates. So students who have the CDA can come into any of the consortium institutions and be able to get 6 semester hours of credit as they come into that, a minimum of 6 credit hours. There's a few others that are providing a little bit more credit. So these are two particular levers that we know may have been barriers to the students coming into the program, and so we continue to support them through that as well. On the next slide, we continue to talk about the importance of modality. And so what we have seen is that programs have been redesigning themselves to include or to enhance. online and evening delivery, weekend courses, cohorts. We have a couple of cohorts that have launched in Spanish. So thinking through, again, the population that we're serving and our intentionality around that, increasing bilingual tutors and mentors, and a variation of term. And so, thinking beyond just sort of the traditional 16 weeks, but thinking through what are the other sort of blocks of time that we can do that. And so I think, as we think about how the consortium serves folks, we know that these are going to be important levers, because the way that I can attend, whether that's on site at my work facility, whether that's because I can go one night a week, whether that's because I can do some combination of online or hybrid, we continue to make sure that we focus on that. Excuse me. A couple other things I just want to highlight for you real quickly before I turn it over to Carissa. One is on the next slide, we talk about navigators. And I'll talk about this a little bit like a 1-2. So navigators are really the folks who are external to the colleges. They are in our child care and resource and referral agencies. They are folks who are working with incumbent workers all the time and helping them to understand what their educational options are, what their opportunities are, how they apply for aid, how they apply for scholarship, how they get all these things ready to come back to college. On the next slide, we talk a little bit about mentors then, and mentors are sort of the guide on the inside. So these are folks, these mentors or coaches we've placed on the inside of institutions in order to make sure that when a person comes from outside who maybe has not been enrolled for some time, coming back into the college, they have someone who is able to support them through their enrollment, through the program, so that they can understand, where they get things from, how do they access services, how do they make sure the bill is paid, how do I make sure I understand the technology? All of those things become critical components of the the role as well. And then finally, one of the other levers that we think we can lift up in the consortium, and on the next slide there you see, is early childhood faculty preparation grants. And so one of the things that we know is that we, as much as we have the early childhood workforce, we also know we have an aging faculty workforce. And so, excuse me, it's critical for us to make sure that we are supporting faculty development across the board, to make sure that we continue to have folks who are able to teach and to guide students through their program as well. So we have launched 4 particular grants to expand educational pipelines and to increase the number of diverse early childhood faculty in Illinois as well. So everything from thinking through dual credit teachers to faculty preparation and sort of a sense of grow your own, but how we're going to make sure that we can support the workforce when and to continue to educate the workforce. So that's the focus of those early childhood grants. I think one other thing I'll mention before I close to Carissa is to make sure that we also talk a little bit about debt relief. So we've tried to make the pathway clear enough that when students return, that they are not worried about how they're going to pay for things. If they left institutions before and have debt, we have tried to make clear in the process that there is a way for them to access debt relief that will help pay down or pay off previous balances that they may have at institutions that they have attended before. So we really want to make sure that we focus on supporting students, not just in the program itself, but financially throughout. So again, as we go to that last slide there, we know that working in early childhood can be very difficult. And I like the way that this particular person says it. It's with this grant, I feel like someone finally sees us. Because these are working adults. These are folks who are every day trying to figure out, how do I make things work? How do I make ends meet? This is a passion I have. How do I make sure my passion can support what I need to do? And so I will tell you that we know that not just in what happens in higher ed, it's important for us to make sure we understand those cross the board kinds of issues as well. So one of the other things on the next slide you'll see is that we certainly have to build this support from across all agencies. And so I'm going to pass it to Carissa to talk a little bit about, in particular, about ISBE's role and how we help to support this particular workforce.
Thank you, Marcus. This work is so exciting, and ISBE is, we are very pleased to be part of this work. As Marcus said, I'm Carissa Hurley Davis. I'm the Director of Early Childhood at our State Board of Education. Prior to coming to the State Board of Education, I had 30 years of experience working in community-based agencies and childcare centers. I saw firsthand how difficult it is for the early childhood workforce to be maintained, to be recruited and retained. So I'm very happy to see that this work is being done, and ISBE is happy to be part of it. Next slide, please. I'm going to share with you some of the works at ISBE, Illinois State Board of Education. I'm going to go through some of how we are supporting the Early Childhood ACE program. Next slide. Just sharing a little data. We know on the screen, you'll see there are trends, and this shows the enrollment and completion trends of people entering the early childhood licensure program. From this slide, we see that more enter enrollment into these programs, but less than half have completed over the years when you look at this data from 2015 to 2021. And so the supports that are in place now, we're hoping to close this gap. Next slide, please. ISBE has, we manage our early childhood block grants for our state, and that's our Preschool for All expansion and prevention initiative programs. Staff working in these programs, the PFA and PFAE, that's Preschool for All and Preschool for All expansion, they are required to have certain credentials. And so on the screen, you will see the credentials that are required. At minimum, the teacher has to have a professional educator license with the early childhood endorsement. And then there are, we can put this link in the chat that you can click on and see like the different types of the act that applies to this licensure. There's also additional requirements for teachers working in these classrooms. There's a blended classroom, and so that teacher, in addition to having the early childhood endorsement with the Pell, they have to have the early childhood special ed approval. And then you'll see there's also for our bilingual education, there's the transitional bilingual education program, licensure and bilingual endorsement that's required. The teacher assistants in the classrooms are required to have a professional educator's license. So that just gives you a little overview of the credentials that are required. We know that it is difficult for programs to meet these, to find staff for these, with these credentials to run the programs. So next slide, please. So because we do know that there's difficulties, there are multiple short-term options available to help alleviate early childhood education shortages. As well, we have the expedited ways for current teachers to add the early childhood endorsement to their licenses. On the screen, you'll see some of these approvals. And so there's the temporary approval for early childhood educators. And this is one of our more popular ones. If you have a Gateways Level 5 credential, along with some other coursework, you would be qualified to serve as a teacher, a lead teacher in our Preschool for All and Preschool for All expansion programs while you're completing your early childhood endorsement. And so we are hoping that those staff, it is the goal that those staff working under this temporary approval will take part in the Early Childhood ACEs program so that they can successfully complete their degrees. And then there's also short-term approvals in early childhood and as other short-term approvals, as you see on here, for emergency early childhood special ed. There's content knowledge pathways, there's approval on the Pell and paraprofessionals. Next slide, please. I just wanted to show this slide. Our prevention initiative program is our 0 to 3 program. And these are the teachers in these classrooms do not necessarily have to have a degree, but they do have to meet the minimum requirements from our Department of Children and Family Services. And you will see those on this screen. We also have a home visiting program, and those models require the credentials for these programs are in the model that they use. And some of our programs use Baby Talk, some use Parents as Teachers. So that dictates what the credential will be for those programs. So just wanted to show you that as one of our early childhood block grant programs. Next slide, please. Smart Start Illinois is in Illinois, that our governor has invested in early childhood in our state, and Smart Start Illinois will provide $75 million for our early childhood block grant program. Now, what that means is that we're going to expand our preschool slots in our state by 5,000 preschool for all slots per year for the next 4 years. That means we're going to need to increase our workforce within our state. So preschool for all will require about 250 new Pell teachers, as well as 250 new paraprofessionals. And also our preschool for all expansion program, which is our full day program. I do want to point out that PFA is 2.5 hours and PFAE is a minimum of 5 hours per day. And so we'll need an additional 350 teachers, and I'm sorry, we will be serving an additional 350 children and need about 18 additional Pell teachers and paraprofessionals, along with additional staffing for our prevention initiative programs. So it is important that we're excited about this program because the early childhood ACEs will help to meet the need of the staff for Smart Start Illinois and our increase of slots. Next slide, please. We know teacher recruitment, teacher and staff recruitment is important. ECE is currently seeking proposals for a 4th round of the CTE Education Career Pathway State Grant. And this funding will support planning and implementation of the CTE Education Career Pathway and Program of Study. Programs include coursework designed to prepare students to graduate into, to matriculate into, and success into a post-secondary teacher preparation program. It will also afford students the opportunity to participate in field experience and/or work-based learning to hone in their craft and gain experience in different educational settings and content areas. Additionally, programs will have opportunities to earn dual credit, industry certifications such as paraprofessional license, the state seal of biliteracy, college and career pathway endorsement, and other micro credentials to demonstrate teaching competencies through the program. And so these are supports that we have to recruit staff, teachers and staff. Next slide, please. And then as we prepare, when you look at teacher preparation, you see on the screen, ECE allows and we encourages our higher institutions of higher ed to utilize prior learning experience towards coursework. And as you see, we're utilizing prior learning experience. We've looked to streamline the process to submit a program change form if an option is available program-wide. We also made some updates to our Part 225 rules to remove duplicate coursework. Also student teaching, there's some changes that are being made to student teaching changes to support members of the incumbent workforce, and then also looking at compensation for student teaching. Next slide, please. In considering teacher retention initiative, we do have our new teacher coach and mentoring program. We have the National Board of Professional Teaching Standards. There are affinity groups that were created by that we've created and partnered with Teach Plus with. And so the link, we'll put the link in the chat where you can go and see where those are. Affinity groups are in our state. There's also special education grants, and this year, with our early childhood block grant funding, we provided cost of living adjustments for staff working in community-based organizations. We know there's a concern between teachers working in school districts and teachers working in community-based organizations. There's a concern regarding pay parity. And so our first step was this fiscal year 23, where we provided a 5% COLA to all staff working in these programs in community-based organizations. And through Smart Start Illinois, we're looking to do more of that in the upcoming years as we expand slots as well. Next slide. So I'm going to turn it back over to Michelle, and she will talk about the future funding of the work in early childhood.
Must unmute myself in order to talk. Huh? Okay, next slide, please. So Governor Pritzker announced the launch of the new Early Childhood Initiative, Smart Start Illinois. So Smart Start Illinois is a multi-year plan to transform early childhood education and care for our youngest Illinoisans. And what does it do? It provides every Illinois child with access to preschool, increased funding to the child care workforce, and raises wages and quality. It allows us to invest new early childhood facilities and expand locations and reach more vulnerable families with early support and resources. And just as a reminder, this is a proposal for FY24. Our legislative session is still underway. We don't have a budget for fiscal year 24, our fiscal year starts July 1st. So all of this is subject to sufficient appropriation by the General Assembly. So as we're building out this new, all these new initiatives, and all of the ECACE work that's going on has been funded by all of our COVID relief money, and it will continue to be funded in fiscal year 24 by COVID relief money. But the Smart Start Illinois plan is actually going to allow us to stabilize the workforce and continue all this good work that we're doing. So that is it's kind of like the 4-year plan that we're building out. Next slide, please. So here are some of the investments, this $250 investment, or $250 million investment. So like Carissa mentioned earlier, $75 million will go to the PFA and PFAE early childhood block grants, $130 million for the nation leading childcare workforce compensation contracts. And I would go into a little bit more about what those are, but they are sort of contracts that will pay in, like CCAP pays in reimbursements. This will pay upfront payments instead of in arrears to kind of raise the quality of the workforce. $40 million will go into invest into early intervention programming. $5 million will go into expanding DHS's home visiting programs. And some additional investments $100 million will go into capital dollars for building early childhood facilities. $70 million will go into state invested CCAP programs. We'll use state funding to invest more in CCAP. $12 million will go in over the next 4 years to more scholarship programs such as ECACE, and $1.6 million will go into the Dolly Parton Imagination Library, which is a statewide literacy initiative. So those are just some of the initiatives that will come out of this 4-year Smart Start plan over the next 4 years. And there is tons more investments that the governor is making in K-12 education, and I could talk a lot about that, but we will we'll leave it all to the ECACE or the EC field in this one. So I will turn it back over to Marcus to talk about
Sure. Thank you.
What's next?
Yep.
I'm not quite sure what's next, but I'll turn it
No,
back over to
and I think you talked a little bit about that. So on the next slide, for example, you'll see that Smart Start includes sort of the investment across the board. So both in early childhood, but also in the supports that we would see in K-12. So including launching the teacher pipeline and expanding access to evidence-based, investing in the K-12 evidence-based funding formula, access to computer science and coursework, clean energy career. These are all sort of part of the bigger investments in the K-12 system. So you'll see a little bit of that. And then on the next slide, you'll see this continuation of funding in the higher education population as well, including $100 million investment into the MAP program, which is the Monetary Award Program that helps fund students to actually access college. So what we know is that, again, in this particular population, we know that we're still serving the most needy workers, frankly, in this population. So we want to make sure that we continue to have the supports to be able to fund them, including the overall sort of increase in the higher education system. I think that the goal is to make sure that all of our education systems, whether that's early childhood, whether that's the full K-12 system, whether that's higher ed, are all working together to make sure that we continue the funding and the support of the early childhood program across the board. So finally, just to wrap up a little bit, you can go actually a couple slides ahead. Just to talk a little bit about sort of what we were able to accomplish in year one. Certainly launching that was an important endeavor. We had 60 days past the legislation to actually hold the first consortium meeting. So we did that with 2 days to spare. But again, part of the legislation talks about agreeing on how to provide credit for the CDA, making sure that we have established protocols for the navigators and mentors, that we have thought about and begin to uptick the seamless transfer of the AAS degree, that we make sure that the programs are providing the options, including everything from online and hybrid, high flex programs, but whatever course sharing opportunities, all those to make sure that they support working adults. That we launched the scholarship, which in total has given nearly $35 million or so out to students, that we have launched the advisory, and that frankly, we have provided some clarification around administrative rules, both for NASBE and for ICCB. So I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the need for administrative change around credit for prior learning and some of the changes that we did at ICCB in order to make sure that we can do that. Thinking through what this looks like in sort of this current year and in the future, on the next slide, we talk about what we have done. So we just recently completed a needs assessment for the work of the consortium with Afton partners, thinking about what happens now that the consortium is established, what happens now that the advisory is established. How do we make sure that we're building sustainable pathways to make sure that this work continues? Because even when the COVID relief funding goes away, the work is still required. So we know that we still have to make sure that we're building the supports out to sustain the work, that we continue to think through and make sure that the implementation of credit for the CDA and the AAS transfer are still working. We are now launching more formally communities of practice and working groups that will be important in moving the work forward, particularly around higher education institutions. In addition to that, thinking through the evaluation process and what that looks like. And again, I mentioned earlier that we're expanding the eligibility for applicants of the scholarship beginning in the fall of 23. So going into that third year, we know that we're going to be able to access a little bit more. But I think one of the biggest things that I can say is that we continue to make sure that we align all of our efforts around the evolving landscape of early childhood. Even in the state agencies that I mentioned earlier, we know that there's still movement and nuance there. And so we know that it's critical for us to continue to meet, to continue to talk through, and to continue to coordinate the work so that we are not sort of overstepping each other, that we're not, misaligned in terms of how this work gets done and gets solved. So I laugh because I think I see Michelle and Carissa in more meetings than I see some of my own team members in meetings. So it is work that I think is working, and I think that we understand is necessary to make sure that we move this forward. So with that, I'm gonna turn it back over to Winona, and I think maybe have a few questions. And I will add that we do have some contact information for us at the end of the slide as well.
Great, thank you so much, Marcus. So if Renee, you can maybe project the last slide. So let people just write down their contact information, that would be great. So we do see there are some questions in the Q&A and also in the chat box. I think off the top of my head, I just want to know about this articulation agreement, this process, because this is a big part of the work when you think about how to,
Sure.
you know, help those EC educator. Everybody, I'm sure they want to get their degree, they want to get AA, they want to get a BA, they want to get MA, right? So can you talk a little bit more about that process and what are the best practices that you can share?
Sure. And Carissa mentioned this, and I'll just dive in a little bit deeper. So for our associate and applied science degrees, they're based on what our gateways, credentials, our entitlement programs all of those early childhood programs have to be entitled. And so a level 4 is really where a student exits from the AAS degree. And the level 5 is generally what students get as they exit a baccalaureate degree. And so the challenge around articulation has really been about making sure that we articulate levels as opposed to courses. So it's really challenged the institution to move away from a course-to-course articulation, but to really think about how do I take a student from a level 4 to a level 5? And that includes both sort of the level 5, sort of a director pathway, or the level 5 professional educator license. So it really does mean that the institutions had to be thoughtful about what becomes important. So we mentioned some of the changes and clarifications from NASBE, that when we talked about general education content, that didn't mean a course, that meant content. And so institutions got to rethink what that looked like in terms of a degree requirement, in terms of a course or how you might incorporate that into other courses. So I think what it allowed us to do is to unravel sort of things that get historically wrapped up in higher ed, right? Higher ed says, well, that all those things must be a course. So we'll just put this course here, and then that course would be gen ed, and then that course count over here. But when you untangle all of those requirements, it really caused us to rethink both how we structure programs and how we move a student through the program. So the scholarship expansion will allow us to sort of continue those conversations around what I'll call course-to-course articulation, those who are really in transfer programs intending to continue their education. But it also causes us to think through what happens to the person who needs to stop, the on and off ramp, as we talk about, who needed to go to work, who's working in the field, who has lots of expertise in the field. How do we make sure that we can bring them back on? And how do we make sure that we can begin, I saw that question earlier, to think about how do we document that experience? So thinking through past just the CDA, but how do we make some sense in terms of credit, if you will, or support for acknowledging their expertise as they come back into higher ed programs. So in the act, there is a call out about sort of thinking through standard ways that we can acknowledge and support the transferability of credit for prior learning as well, or prior learning assessment. How do we begin to think about a standardized process for that? And so work continues in that in terms of trying to make sure that we can sort of support that portion of educational delivery as well.
Gotcha. So
Awesome.
It seems like there's still like a conversation ongoing. So I know we don't have a lot of time to talk about articulation agreement, but all the audience, you can see that my colleagues already put Marcus, Michelle, and Carissa's email in the chat. So please reach out to them to ask your questions, since we don't have a lot of time focus on that today. One other question I saw, I know Michelle, you touched on that already, which is on the financing, the funding mechanism. So we know that you talk about you guys received I don't know how much from the COVID relief dollar as the first year funding, and also you kind of secured the second year already. Now it seems like very promising for the future funding as well to support this program. Can you talk a little bit more, like how much you received for the first year to kick off this program?
So we used CURSA funding, and now we're using our ARPA stabilization and funds. And we have until September of 25 to expend those funds. And we're using a large portion of those funds to fund this work. And so we're hoping that Smart Start Illinois doesn't get cut in the budget, and that we're able to secure funding into the future. How much and what it'll look like, that's still kind of up in the air. But we're hopeful that the governor, in the governor's proposal, obviously, I would say between all three, IBHE, the Illinois Board of Higher Ed, ISAC, and ICCB, you're looking at like 100 million, I would say, between all three grantees that fund the 2-year institutions, the 4-year institutions, and all the administrative costs. It's right at 100. It's about 100 million a year. Although, you know, with underspending and stuff, you know, and with the project just being, you know, new, and, you know, I would say we're hoping that this year is our most successful yet, like Marcus said. So we're hopeful that we're getting it underway. So
Great.
yeah, we're everything is just so unknown with not having a budget. So we're getting there.
Great,
So.
great. Thank you for that. And I also think it's so important that you all have a shared vision in Illinois, so you all come together. That's why I think this is a program we need to promote on NASBE's platform. We need to let our member know that this is happening. It could happen working well with the higher ed, right? So can you guys, maybe this is the last question I'm going to throw out there. So can you guys talk about, like, how do you keep this engagement, have this shared vision, keep everybody, you know, have a great working relationship, great partnership? How do you keep that within different agencies?
Well, I think, and then I'll talk quickly, and then I'll sort of deflect to some of the other panelists. I think you have to have a champion in each agency. So I think the one thing is you have to know who is the go-to person within any agency to make sure that the work gets coordinated, and you have to sort of set the priority to meet regularly. I think you can't leave it to happenstance to make sure that happens. So those would be the two things I think that sort of help us. I think, though, you know, having a champion at each agency certainly has helped us lead the way to do that. And I'll let the other ones chime in too.
I do agree with Marcus. We have times that we meet, like he said, I've met with Marcus more than I've met with some of my ISBE team members, because we meet constantly. We meet a lot. And as the discussions come up, as the State Board of Education, when things come up, we can say, oh, we can address that at ISBE. We'll take that on. So I think in the meetings, really seeing what needs to be happening. The goal is to eliminate all of the barriers so that people can be successful and complete this. And it takes all of us. So whatever we can do on our side with the State Board of Education, that's what we do during those meetings. And that's where changes to licensure came. That's where, you know, we knew student teaching was the issue, you know, because at one point you weren't able to do student teaching where you work. So there's changes that are being done that, you know, the state board can do that's going to support the work of the Illinois Community College Board and this ECACE program. So again, it's just regular meeting, consistency, and everyone being engaged and having those champions at our respective agencies.
Great. Anybody else have anything to add? No?
For the sake of time, I will just concur with my colleagues.
Great. Okay, so go ahead.
I think it helps to enjoy the work. I mean, I think that's the other thing, you know, for as challenging as the work can be, for as challenging as systems, and if you've ever had to change an administrative rule for any reason, You know, the work is challenging, but I think you know, as you enjoy the work and you enjoy what you're doing, and in this case, I think we're able to see how our work impacts more directly, more immediately, those that we're trying to benefit. I think that helps as well.
Right. Great. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. This is a great presentation. I hope we can invite you guys back maybe next year to give us more updates. And Renee, if you don't mind to kind of show us the next upcoming events from NASBE. Yeah, so we do have a release of our new standard, NASBE standard on high school, a redesign, High School That Matters, on May 16. And for all the NASBE members, don't forget we have our new member institute coming up, June 26th, July 26th, and August the 30th. And we did send you the survey for our annual conference. We want to hear from you. Please respond by May 19th. So again, thank you so much, everybody. I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you, all the speakers. Thank you so much. And we'll see you next time. All right. Bye, everybody.